G'day chaps, tis I, Clownpuncher139. Despite how many villains we face in the Arkham saga, when looking at a glance, their goons all appear to be exactly the same. Does it really matter if you're fighting Joker's army over Penguins when they all fight identically? Well, as a matter of fact, yes. Contrary to popular belief, it would actually be to your benefit to fight certain factions over others, and we need look no further than simple game details for your explanation. Some factions are simply smarter or better fighters than the others, to the point that some factions actually pose a threat, while others might as well be toddlers with Nerf guns. So, without further ado, here's a tier list ranking every Arkham faction from weakest to strongest. As you can see, I've arranged 6 basic tiers based on how much of a threat Batman would consider these factions to be, from literal babies to actually posing a threat. So, let's go one at a time in the most chronological order I can manage and determine who the most threatening actually is. Starting, of course, with the very first faction we've ever fought, Jokers in Arkham Asylum, and I'll go ahead and put them in the A tier. Since they're the only faction we fight in Asylum, we don't have any comparisons to make to others trying to kill us. But with regard to the rest of the series, they do a pretty damn good job through and through. They adapt to Batman's tactics throughout the game, forcing him into dangerous scenarios quite often that he has to get really creative to get out of. The most notable thing about these goons is how often they roll out new gear to try and stop Batman. First, they gain access to the armory to get snipers, which essentially gives them full control of the island. Then down the line they get knives and stun sticks to keep Batman from hitting them up close, and by the end of the game they prime his beloved gargoyles to explode, taking away one of the few tactics he had to deal with guns. They're obviously complete idiots, but they know how to work together decently well, and their main priority is always killing Batman. The simple fact that they successfully take over the island and are pretty much always able to keep Batman at bay while Joker works on his plan makes them worthy of the A tier. And while they're not technically a faction and just a bunch of roaming enemies, I guess I'll go ahead and count the Lunatics from Asylum as well, which I will actually also go ahead and give the A tier. While they go down in a single hit and are incredibly stupid, it doesn't take away from how easily they can kill unsuspecting players. Hell, they're able to pick off quite a few of Joker's men single-handedly. If Batman wasn't paying enough attention, they could have easily gotten the jump on him as well, which is exactly what they excel at. They hide in the bushes and air vents waiting for someone to come along so they can jump out and latch onto their backs, clawing at their face. And God forbid you attract more than once. At that point, running is no longer an option because of how fast they are. So, you know, good luck. There's obviously not really a ton of details I can go into, but they're pretty threatening, especially to newer players, so I feel like A tier is fair. Starting off our city factions, we have the duality of Two-Face's crew. And if we didn't include post-game content here, they would absolutely be an F tier. You only encounter them at the very start of the game, and as soon as Batman jumps in to beat them up, they all run away like little sissy babies. There's 50 of you in this one room. Why are you running away when you could easily take on Batman yourselves? But then you consider the post-game, where they wipe out Penguin's entire army and take over his museum like it's nothing. Granted, this was after Batman took over the museum himself and locked Penguin in a display case, but Penguin still had so many goons patrolling the Bowery, and Two-Face took out all of them. On top of that, they also pushed the GCPD officers back into the Iceberg Lounge, taking the museum from them by sheer force. That's pretty impressive. So, just for that absolute power move at the end of the game, I'm gonna bump Two-Face's crew up to C tier. They stand absolutely no chance against Batman, but they can definitely shoot guns pretty well if they were able to decimate Penguin's literal army in the Bowery and make it through a GCPD firing squad blocking the entrance to the museum. And speaking of the little man, let's talk about Penguin next. He's very difficult to talk about though because of how the game plays out. He's on the defensive for the entire game from both Batman and the other factions. Two-Face and Joker hate him more than anyone else, so they both focus their efforts on completely wiping him off the map. That said, until Batman steps in to rescue Mr. Freeze, he does a pretty decent job holding them off. His museum is a near impenetrable fortress that barely even takes any damage from direct missile strikes in Protocol 10. If Batman hadn't stepped in, I have little doubt Penguin would have held his ground against both of his enemies. That aside, Cobblepot has some pretty good showings throughout the game. His first obvious action was capturing Freeze and taking over the GCPD, albeit with Strange literally handing Freeze over to him in a power move to help him win the war over Joker. And right after that, he pulls a massive power move of his own and cuts off Joker's forces by blowing up the freeways, meaning he cut off what was supposedly the one path between his and Joker's turf. Now, he did leave some men behind in doing so, but it was a sacrifice he was willing to make. Though it should definitely be worth noting that Penguin and his goons had no idea there were moles among his ranks, and had to get bailed out of said situation by Strange. 10 of his men were undercover cops for who knows how long, and Penguin was none the wiser. And judging by the fact that he may have known their names, since he acknowledges that they work for him when presented with the list, that implies they made it decently high up the ranks. That's more than a little disturbing and is probably gonna hurt his tiering a bit. When Batman invades the museum, we see that Penguin has a little arena brawl planned for him. He says that he only takes the best for new recruits, but seeing how easily Batman disposes of all of them, he's clearly exaggerating a little. But when it comes to his actual men, we can clearly see he garners the most loyalty from them. Penguin's men are easily the most positive about their boss compared to everyone else in the series. Whether it's because they actually respect him, know they'll actually get paid, or feel the least likely to get killed is up for debate. But you can tell these guys actually like their job and aren't just working for the little man to save their skins. There's a mutual respect among Penguin's ranks that the other factions don't have, which I feel is worthy of some points. Unfortunately, that's just about all they have to show for. Penguin is wiped out after the first third of the game, and his crew makes no kind of comeback. But for the early stages of the game, they are decently threatening and put up a good fight until Batman shows up. As far as I'm concerned, if Batman hadn't disrupted the faction war as much as he did, Penguin probably would have held his own throughout Protocol 10. So for that, I'm gonna give him a B tier. By far the most threatening criminal faction in Arkham City is Joker's crew. They are incredibly active throughout Arkham City and have arguably the best stronghold of the three factions. They make heavy advances on Penguin's turf through the sewers, creating an unintended pincer maneuver with Two-Face to lock the bird in. You'll notice that Penguin is the first crew in control of the subway during the early game, but as soon as Batman takes care of their boss, Joker's crew makes their move. They take over the sewers and make a strategic advance towards the subway until they've made it all the way to the Bowery and end up wiping out a lot of Penguin's goons. But they're also smart enough to try recruiting some stragglers because they obviously took some heavy losses of their own. Despite being portrayed as some of the biggest idiots in fiction, this crew is really freaking smart. Backing up to earlier in the game though, their first major action is literally the second mission of the game where they take over the church and hold the staff hostage. They're able to do that with only 4 guys and Harley, which is immensely impressive since there's like 10 staff in there, Aaron Cash and other guards among them. When we get to the steel mill a little later, we see just how large his army is, with at least 20 armed guys gathering in the entryway, eventually heading out to try capturing Freeze. How effective that rollout was is up for debate, but that's not really something we can go into. Joker turned the steel mill into a serious fortress, and his men use its layout to their advantage incredibly well. They set up multiple ambushes for Batman both in the assembly line and with the manager's office, showing how well they worked together to come up with strategies that would work on anybody else who wasn't Batman. They were even able to hold Batman off long enough to let their boss set up a trap, albeit with the help of Mr. Hammer. We see later that just a few of them were able to wipe out Penguin's crew guarding the outside of the GCPD, but aren't quite smart enough to actually get inside. They actually hold their position around the GCPD for pretty much the entire rest of the game. Even when Freeze gets back there to start working on the cure for Batman, they hold the perimeter and even set up guards on buildings to try taking the Bat down. And immediately after Batman's fight with Freeze, we see the Joker set up even more guards across the industrial district, almost all with sniper rifles. They do a really good job at adapting to their situation and constantly bolstering their defenses. They set up tons of traps throughout the steel mill for Batman's inevitable return, and most of them probably would have worked if not for broken video game logic. Especially that one sniper in the loading bay, he is incredibly smart. And that's somehow still not all, because after Protocol 10 happens, we see that they took over the movie theater and set up a ton of snipers in one of the most intricate layouts imaginable, where almost every single one is being watched by another. They even all end up waiting outside the theater during the Clayface fight as they await their boss coming out immortal. They did a ton of stuff in the main story. On top of fighting a war with Penguin, and winning I might add, they set up some of the best defenses against Batman imaginable. Joker's crew are some of the most threatening members we've seen thus far. But let's not forget the post-game DLC, Harley Quinn's Revenge, where that same crew gathers together to now work under Harley. And their showing in this story easily bumps up their ranks by a lot. They're able to stand their ground in Arkham City while everyone else was being evacuated and turn the industrial district into an even more dangerous fortress than usual. They've got snipers and other armed guards everywhere. They've got a password system that's nearly impossible to crack, with a new hideout that nobody was able to find until Batman did some scarily good detective work. On top of holding multiple GCPD officers captive to lure Batman in, they held Batman himself captive for 2 straight days, forcing Robin to come in and rescue him. And when he does, their defenses are even more bolstered, as they've got even more armed guys, sentry guns, and a freaking Titan waiting to kill him. And even when Batman is rescued, she has a contingency plan to kill him with super powerful explosives across the whole building. And even when he disarms them, Harley throws all logic out the window and uses the mechanical guardians from Wonder City as a final obstacle to kill Batman. Cause yeah, that's also happened back in the main story. During Protocol 10, Joker's crew went down to Wonder City to steal the mechanical guardians, and succeeded at removing them without a trace. And when that didn't work, she blows up the whole building anyway with a bomb that can't be disarmed. This crew is honestly insane. The stuff they did in base Arkham City was enough to give them at least A tier, but Harley Quinn's Revenge skyrockets them up to S tier. The sheer fact that they were able to hold Batman himself captive for 2 days straight is a feat I cannot ignore. Easy S tier for the clowns. Finally, closing off Arkham City, we have TYGER. And these guys are the most obvious S tier that it's not even funny. The first and most obvious point is that they were specifically trained by Hugo Strange to kill Batman. They are far more organized and prepared than any of the other factions in this game, with much stricter callouts and orders making them far more efficient. They easily wipe out enemy factions left behind and take over their turf, meanwhile also prepping the room for when Batman inevitably shows up by planting mines and snipers in the perfect locations to catch Batman off guard. Even during melee combat sections, they're shown to be much more effective, because they bring in tons of weapons to counter Batman, and even call for backup when they start to lose too many fighters. And lest I forget that they also set up a seemingly inescapable trap for Batman on top of Wonder Tower's elevator, where the only reason he escaped was because of poor building design, not of their tactics or even Batman's counter tactics. It's literally just because the architect left a hole in the roof of the elevator. And let's not also forget that they literally cannot be afraid. Their training is so good that they will never be terrified of Batman, even if there's only one of them left. If they see Batman, they will shoot him immediately. No scare tactics work on them, which is literally Batman's biggest crutch for any situation. Strange gave them the best training and equipment imaginable. If all these factions went to war with one another, I have no doubt that TYGER would come out on top. For such an admittedly small showing with how little screen time they get, they show just how threatening they can be. Easiest S tier of my life. They go all the way to the top of it, in fact, surpassing Joker's crew. First up for Arkham Origins, we have the Mobsters, which is Black Mask turned Joker's crew. And they're pretty good, all things considered. They're a far cry from the menaces they become in later games, but are at least still decently threatening in their own rights. Naturally, their first showing is the intro to the game, the Blackgate Riot. It takes them basically no time at all to plunge this whole prison into chaos, though they did have some outside help with Killer Crocs, so I can't allot all the damage to them. Even still, they managed to overwhelm the Warden and kill Commissioner Loeb in just a few hours, while also freeing a lot of prisoners, Calendar Man among them. It's a pretty threatening first showing, and we're just getting started. They tend to stay in the background for most of the early game, but their background actions are surprisingly impactful, because they're planting explosives all across the city. We see quite early on that they're able to plant them right underneath the GCPD without anyone knowing except Batman. And when we later get to the hotel, we see Joker has plungers for tons of buildings across the city, including the very hotel they're standing in. And with how massive the demonstration explosion is, it can be safe to assume just how many explosives he's purchased and planted. A lot. If any of those triggers went off, there'd be a lot more loss than insurance benefits. They taper off a bit for the next few hours, but when we get to the Gotham Merchants Bank, we see what kind of crew we're dealing with. They're willing to kill Black Mask defectors with no remorse. So while they may be reducing their numbers, they're also whittling out all the weak links. And they really just get away with betraying Black Mask. There are absolutely no consequences after the fact, and their boss just leaves them defeated. Can't really say if that's power on their part or weakness on Black Mask's, but let's go with power for the sake of making my job easier. And actually, in the steel mill, they have a few impressive moments. They set up ambushes for Batman, like the sentry gun behind the office door and the large crew behind the wall ready to fight him. It's not too much, but it does show that they were ready to fight Batman when he finally showed up. By far their biggest showing, though, occurs just a little later at the Gotham Royal. Not only have they locked down the entire hotel, albeit with the help of GCPD to keep some people out, but they end up turning the ballroom into a death trap amusement park. This whole area and the roller coaster burning along the outside of the tower was built in a single night. That sounds absolutely impossible, especially with the snowstorm going on outside, but they somehow did it. And in doing so, created a nightmare scenario for both Batman and any potential hotel guests. Unfortunately, any control they had over the hotel is lost when Bane's crew comes in, we'll get to them later, and kill all of them with no effort. And that's about all they do. Some of them show up for the second Blackgate riot, but it's mostly random prisoners causing the chaos this time. So, yeah, the mobsters are pretty weird in Origins. They set themselves up to be rather threatening, but fall short in a lot of areas. Overall, I think B tier is fair, especially with all the explosives they planted across the city. Next up, we have Penguin's crew, which aren't in the game for too long and aren't that threatening for the short period they are. They spend most of their time struggling to keep the final offer afloat while Penguin has his meeting with Alberto. They technically hold Alberto's bodyguard captive for a while, but it's a whole crew versus a single guard, so not that impressive. And that's technically it. All the rest of their action takes place behind the scenes because they work in tandem with a lot of other factions by supplying them weapons. They most notably hit up Bane's crew, but also work on bribing the GCPD quite often to get Penguin out of sticky situations. While their actual showings are pretty uneventful, the fact that they work to make some of the other factions more dangerous is something to commend. And let's not forget that they also supply all the arms for Arkham Origins Online. And the fact that they're able to supply a war between Joker and Bane is definitely worth some points. However, let's not forget that they also show up in Cold Heart, and they have a much more impressive showing here, since they're working for a much more threatening boss. Part of that is, of course, getting the cryo weapons from Freeze that let them completely terrorize the city. But even without them, they have a much more impressive lineup. They're able to hold the entirety of GothCorp under lockdown, including some of the staff, and do a great job working in tandem with Freeze during the final fight. And of course, they also invade and try to burn down Wayne Manor. Let's not forget about that. They're able to hold a lot of partygoers hostage and successfully capture Ferris Boyle with pretty little effort. Not to mention how much chaos they're able to cause within the city with those freeze guns. They freeze some half of the police force without even trying. It's a much needed activity upgrade to their lacking appearance in base game. So all that taken into account, I'll put them in B tier. Now we have the only law enforcement representation on this list, with the GCPD. They're technically an enemy faction, so I'm going to talk about them. And they're also weird to talk about. They're obviously going to be rather threatening since they're the police force, but they don't really show it at all. Especially since Batman ends up invading their compound earlier in the game, and they don't even know he's there until the riot breaks out. And when said riot does start, it does not take long for them to be overrun. Batman is in and out of the evidence lockup in less than a minute, and all hell breaks loose. It's a little embarrassing. The only major showing power they have is the SWAT room with like 20 armored guys in one area. But even that isn't very threatening when Batman just casually walks above them. Brandon even has Batman cornered on the roof and probably dead to rights, but a single smoke bomb is enough to throw them off and allow him to escape. Gordon even notes how disappointing Brandon and his crew is when Batman escapes from the hotel.
Let me guess. He got away.
Honestly, the entirety of Origins is just showing how humiliating the GCPD is at this point in the timeline. Most of them can barely fight, and even the highly trained SWAT team is easily taken hostage by a bunch of randos with no coordination hired by Firefly. The biggest achievement they have is securing Blackgate after the riots, but that was only possible after Batman stepped in and got rid of all the major problems. As much as it pains me to do so, I'm gonna have to put them in D tier. The GCPD in Arkham Origins is just so uncoordinated and bad at their job that I can't give them any higher. They put up a few good fights here and there, but their main role in the story is being pushed around by all the other factions, which checks out when you consider that they're constantly being bribed to look the other way by said factions. But because of those few good fights they put up, I can't give them F tier. They can definitely throw a punch or two, but that's about all I'd trust them with. Let's not forget about one of the best side quests and talk about Anarky next. Honestly, Anarchy's supporters are just kinda there. The thing is that they're all just supposed to be average Joes who got tired of the oppression they were facing and rose to the occasion to fight against it. They aren't meant to be seasoned fighters or criminals who do this on the daily. Anarky literally just found a bunch of random guys to join his cause and they did it. That being said, they do have one amazing feat that keeps them out of the lower tiers. They're able to plant bombs across some of the most heavily guarded places in the city, namely Gotham Merchants Bank, the Gotham Casino, and the frickin' GCPD. These are just average workers doing all this, which means that despite their low power, they have moles in all the right places. Information and access is often more impactful than just raw power, and it's clear that Anarky's crew has that. So just for that, I'm giving them a B tier. Last up, we have Bane's Mercenaries, and these guys are an easy A tier. While they don't make the biggest impact on the game they take place in, their threat is very well established. We first meet them in the Gotham Royal Hotel, where they basically wipe out the entirety of Joker's crew without batting an eye. Rather than using them for backup when Batman inevitably arrives, they decide to kill them because they could get in their way. Then, unlike most crews, they actually prepare for Batman's arrival. They prime the gargoyles to blow, but don't immediately have them armed. Instead, they arm them sometime into the fight to throw Batman off his balance. He uses the gargoyles for some time trying to take them out, so suddenly being blasted off is one of the perfect ways to catch him by surprise. On top of that, they're far more organized than most other factions, though are able to be terrified unlike TYGER. However, their greatest showing is in Bane's own lair, where despite it being a surprise invasion by Batman, they can catch him with their own surprise in a trap. They put Batman against some of the most physically demanding members of the crew and hold nothing back against him, and they probably would have won if Batman wasn't such a badass. They even jump in the middle of the brawl between their boss and Batman because of how confident they are, and they're able to hold their own, taking hits from Bane himself quite well. Then, when the fight gets too hot, they just casually blow up a GCPD helicopter and are able to get their boss out of there with no issues. They're so heavily equipped, it's not even funny. Penguin seriously hooked them up. The only weak link in the crew is Bird, who is just such a pussy that he keeps them out of the S tier alone. But even taking their boss out of the equation, they're easily one of the most threatening factions in the series, easily giving them the A tier. We're actually going to go a little out of order for Arkham Knight because I want to end with the most notable faction, so instead we'll go ahead and start with Penguins. Penguin has another weird case in Arkham Knight because he's once again relegated to distributing weapons, but unfortunately doesn't do anything else in the interim to make up for that. He's literally just gun running the whole game, and his crew is so stupid that they lead Batman back to his caches 4 times in a row, and Penguin takes absolutely no precautions to prevent it anytime in the future beyond threats. And they don't even adapt to possibly having Batman show up beyond like a single extra gun blocking the entrance. The most impactful thing they do is kidnap Nightwing, but considering how much Nightwing sucks in this series, that's hardly a compliment. On the plus side though, they do keep the gun running going even while Cobblepot is in prison, and stage a breakout for him after Batman is gone, which shows either contingencies on Penguin's part or initiative on the Goon's part. Both pretty noble feats. Unfortunately, their break-in is a complete joke that I don't want to go into again, so they're going in D tier. They're a massive embarrassment compared to their city counterparts, but aren't the worst of the worst. They have some very small notable feats, but nowhere near enough to get them any higher in the tiers. Moving on to his best frenemy Two-Face, and we have a terrible embarrassment. He literally just spends the entire night robbing banks and is so unsuccessful at it that he's easily going in the F tier. Literally, all they do is run around the bank trying to load stuff into garbage trucks, and only after losing some number of men do they decide Batman is a problem they need to kill. And it's not like breaking into these banks was hard because there's literally no more than 1 guard in each. Hell, Two-Face decides himself that hiring some militia members will be better to kill Batman than his lackluster crew. They're that bad. No question, they go in F tier. I don't even need to take flip of a coin into account because they're equally as embarrassing there as well. They have even more guys than before and lose to Robin with very few struggles. They're an absolute embarrassment and go in F tier. No questions asked. Just because I feel like it, let's talk about Professor Pig's Dollotrons. They only show up for a single mission, but they have such a unique gimmick, so it feels right to talk about them instead of some of the others. The simple fact that they can't feel pain is a big plus for their threat level. But conversely, the fact that they don't do anything without Pig's input is a massive detriment. And they also just don't really fight, they just kinda throw attacks at a target and rely on their stamina to take the enemy down rather than their skills or strength. They also probably have no idea how to hold a gun, let alone how to shoot one, because they're basically brain dead. But just for the fact that they have that whole can't feel pain thing, I feel like putting them in D tier. But going back to main plot stuff, now we have Harley's crew, which does okay for themselves. Disregarding the fact that Henry made their invasion of the movie studios possible, they were able to take everything over in very little time. They were very well equipped for this invasion, with a lot of goons and a lot of guns. Just looking at the start of the Outside Predator section shows this really well. There's a ton of guys here, but they unfortunately don't work together at all. Just look at how spread out they are across this giant area. If one of them goes down, nobody's gonna know about it because the nearest friendly is a good 30 yards away. So while they have the manpower, they do not have the tactics. This is further proven as we go into the studios themselves. They were able to hold off Robin for a good while, which is impressive in its own right, but as soon as Batman comes in, they're all taken out rather easily. This extends to all the time we see with the Joker infected. It's clear as day they don't have any synergy with these new bosses. The ones guarding Bell are doing their best because they at least try to set up a trap for Batman with the minigunner, and they have a lot of guys with guns ready in a much more crowded room than the previous outside section. Unfortunately, they're going against both Batman and Robin, so they don't really stand a chance. Same applies to the ones working with Albert King. His whole gist is just beating them down, then picking them up. They don't work with him at all. And then there's one minigun guarding the path to Charisma, but he is easily disposed of because of the whole gimmick of this section, the voice synthesizer. This gadget completely wrecks their chances of a higher tiering. They obey the stupidest orders from the synthesizer, as simple as moving closer to walls, and as brain dead as opening gates they were specifically closed to keep Batman out. Harley's line before opening the last gate is so true it just hurts. These guys are so much dumber than before because they'll basically obey any order spouted into their earpiece as long as it's Harley's voice. And then Harley just doesn't do anything to solve the synthesizer problem after figuring it out. Instead, just telling them to stop listening to her. At least Arkham Knight and Deathstroke adapt and have them switch channels so they can't be fooled. Harley just says, "Stop listening to me," even though she's the boss and needs to give them orders. While the crew does a decent job with the studio invasion and is able to cause Batman enough of a headache to stop what he's doing and make it his top priority, the problem is that this crew is just too stupid for their own good. They have no synergy with their traps and are so easily exploited that I can't give them anything higher than a C tier. For the first and only time, we can actually talk about Riddler as a faction, since he's got his massive robot army. And yeah, they might as well be S tier. The thing is, without Catwoman to help him, Riddler was absolutely going to win against Batman, because he literally made Batman-proof robots. Batman is physically incapable of touching them without Catwoman there, and with how many robots Riddler has at his disposal, they could have taken over Gotham with his eyes closed. The only reason they're not getting the coveted S tier is because without their leader, they have absolutely nothing. The robots don't have sentience, and without Riddler giving them orders, they would literally do nothing. We see Batman hack their processing computers and order them around with very little effort, literally overwriting Riddler's orders in real time. While he obviously can't overwrite an entire army at once with just the voice synthesizer, the simple fact is that he was able to hack them, which keeps them from advancing beyond A tier. If that hacking problem could be addressed, or they could think independently of Riddler's orders, easy S tier. But For now, they'll stay in A. Even though they technically appear first in the game, it only seems right to end this video on the Militia, especially since many of you are super adamant that they're the most threatening faction in the whole series. I'm here to tell you quite the opposite though. While in theory you could consider them S tier for the simple fact that they were trained by Jason to kill Batman, in execution they don't really show any S tier feats. The problem is that Batman is just so badass in Arkham Knight that unless the titular character is fighting alongside them, the Militia are kinda pussies. Consider every time Batman is a little beaten down. It's always because of some outside force that the Militia then tries and fails to capitalize on. Like right here where Jason shoots him in his side. This brute should have had him dead to rights, but nope, Batman fights back and easily wins. Or here, when they literally have 6 men pointing guns right at him. As soon as Jason's out of the picture, they all go down without any problems. Or, hell, the one potential solution to beating Batman of a suicide vest, easily taken out in 2 seconds because none of your comrades are brave enough to come to your aid. Okay, but that's just combat. Batman usually has the upper hand there, so what about Predator? Surely with guns they'd have a chance, right? Well, compared to the rest of the factions, only kinda. True, they technically have Jason's training and equipment on their side, but compared to the training TYGER got, it's honestly embarrassing. They're still just as disorganized as the rest of the thugs, and only know what to do when Jason comes on the line and tells them personally. The fact that Jason had to tell the commandos he brought with him specifically to trap Batman and Ace about the weak point in his armor, despite that probably being day 1 training, is embarrassing.
Oh, and avoid the bat symbol. It's a little trick. It's where his armor's the strongest.
And this continues for the rest of the game. These idiots forget their own training and need Jason to pop in and remind them what to do when fighting Batman. They do absolutely no preparation despite having the tools at their disposal. At most, they'll probably set up 1 sentry and a mine before Batman shows up, but will then need to be told by Jason to set up more after the fact. Their checkpoints and watchtowers should be threatening, but the fact that they barely even use the turrets specifically set up to take down flying objects to hunt Batman is just sad. They think they're just doing any other job and can skate by on killing Batman. But they clearly needed to learn more from TYGER. One of the only dangerous things they have are the APCs carrying the lieutenants around the city because they're large, nearly impenetrable vehicles with rocket launchers strapped to the top. Except those don't even really make any sense because they've already got the tanks for that exact purpose. Why would you send the most powerful members of your army out onto the streets with little more protection than a few rockets and cars? Especially if they aren't even going to be doing anything. The most threatening thing they do in combat is charge up their suits with electricity, making them impervious to damage. That's pretty smart and cool. And their brutes can be some of the most threatening enemies in the game, being able to carry all 3 power-ups, thus being able to switch up their tactics on a whim. That's smart. Combine that with the medics that can do the aforementioned charging as well as heal up knocked out enemies, and they have a severe threat. If the medics weren't big bright beacons that make them immediate and easy targets for Batman, they might actually be able to do something once in a while. And they were able to set up a pretty successful ambush that probably would have gotten Batman dead if the Batmobile wasn't as overpowered as it was. But that's pretty much the extent of their wins. Because in every other situation, unless Jason is somehow involved, Batman always has the upper hand. So while they certainly aren't bad by any stretch of the imagination, they are nowhere near as threatening as some people make them out to be. I think what many people are mistaking for power is their sheer numbers. Without question, the Militia is the most numerous faction in the series. Their numbers are honestly the only thing they have going for them though. It wasn't strategy or outsmarting Batman that allowed them to set up watchtowers and checkpoints across the city. It was the fact that they had so many men at the ready to man them while Batman was distracted with something else. It isn't their drone tactics that are able to occasionally destroy the Batmobile, it's the fact that you can fight up to 60 of them at once and the sheer number of sight lines is overwhelming. It isn't the fact that they know how Batman thinks his way through Predator sections that makes their sections difficult, it's the fact that you can have 3 minigunners and 4 medics at once. It's not tactics or smarts keeping this faction alive, it's numbers. And as soon as those numbers are picked off, their threat level is no more prevalent than basic rioters. And for that, I can only put them in B tier. They aren't nearly as threatening as TYGER because they literally only have numbers and equipment behind them. TYGER has strategy. You can have as many people on the battlefield as you like. If they aren't trained, you might as well have nobody. One man trained with a pistol is more threatening than 100 untrained with assault rifles. Just look at John Wick. TYGER may have less men and worse equipment, but they are actually trained to kill Batman. The Militia would honestly go way lower if they didn't have the numbers to back them up. But because they do, they are worthy enough for B tier. If you have some evidence to make the Militia's case better, put it in the comments because I'd be totally fine being proven wrong here. And with that, we've reached the end of our factions and the final tier list. Isn't it beautiful? Nah, whatever, enough of that. If you've got a case for any of these factions to be higher or lower, let me know in the comments, and I'll consider editing this rating. For now though, this is the definitive threat level tier list for every Arkham faction I felt like ranking. Yay! With that in mind, do all the YouTube stuff, because now it's time to decide which one to join. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later, chaps.